Firstly, I just want to say that this video was inspired by the World at War Strategy and Tactics of World War II magazine series and their edition, Watch on the Oder. If you haven't seen their stuff, I recommend going to their site and checking it out. Secondly, I want to say I'm an amateur historian and only do this for fun, so I apologise in advance for any inaccuracies that may appear. Now all that is out of the way, let's get into German strategic alternatives to the Battle of the Bulge. Germany in late 1944 was on course for certain defeat. The only question that remained was how long would it take. The Allies had hoped that Market Garden could open a way into Germany and end the war before 1945, which, if had worked, would have probably saved many lives. However, the plan had too many moving parts to be fully successful, and the last bridge at Arnhem was held by the Germans. This failure meant the battle into Germany on the Western Front would be a slow push to, then over, the Rhine. The Allies had become complacent due to their recent victories in France and were at risk of underestimating their enemy, which is exactly what happened on December 16th, 1944. In short, the Battle of the Bulge went like this. The Germans get some momentum after the first day, bad weather prevents Allied air support, Germans bypass Bastogne to keep momentum, but aren't able to take it with other forces. Allies counterattack and reconnect with Bastogne, unhinging the whole offensive and eventually force the Germans to withdraw. A German defeat. Now, what if the High Command had had a change of heart? What if they decided to deploy their last major armoured formations elsewhere? That's what today's video is all about. Now, the first option is the most simple. Keep the reserves as reserves. Keeping the armour back and using them as fire brigades moving to any Allied or Soviet penetrations to prevent any breakthroughs was probably the most logical decision. It would possibly delay Allied advances significantly. However, it is an admission of defeat in a way, and this resigns the German forces to a solely defensive posture when there really wasn't that much more land to give up. So let's get into the more interesting options. Let's stay on the Western Front for the first couple of scenarios. The first alternative we shall go over is shifting the offensive south to Alsace-Lorraine. This one is quite interesting, as something similar did happen in reality. Operation Northwind was launched as a diversionary attack from the Bulge, with limited forces, and that was enough to cause a crisis in Allied High Command, with Eisenhower ordering a withdrawal, whilst de Gaulle refused and threatened to cut off Anglo-American forces from using their rail network. De Gaulle did this as his political situation was rather desperate and he could not afford to lose Strasbourg. Let's go through this scenario, and remember, this is all speculation, as it is impossible to know what would have happened. Both the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies have deployed near the Saarland, preparing their surprise attack on the 7th US Army. Whether or not this attack would be preemptively detected is hard to say. For the sake of the scenario, let's say no. Supporting attacks would come from the Colmar pocket and the flanks. The primary objective would be to encircle as many divisions as possible, recapture Strasbourg, and sow division between the Allied powers. The initial attacks from the armoured formations are successful. They break through the unsuspecting US lines and even manage to take some prisoners, not too dissimilar to St. Vith in our timeline. The terrain here is more forgiving to the heavy tanks of the German army, and there are less stoppages as there are in the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans attacking from the north managed to reach Saarburg within 2 weeks. Now the troops stationed around Strasbourg are seriously threatened with encirclement. The German attacks from the south are less effective due to mountainous terrain and supply issues. Nevertheless, this sends Allied HQ scrambling. They had not expected any German offensive, let alone in a relatively unimportant area of Alsace-Lorraine. Eisenhower orders an immediate withdrawal and for Patton to shift south to counterattack the flanks as soon as possible. The Americans in danger begin moving west to avoid catastrophe. However, most of the French soldiers receive no such order and are told to hold Strasbourg to the last. French soldiers begin taking American equipment and kicking them off the rail system in order to fully support themselves. The division between the French and the Americans are high. The Germans fill in the gaps of withdrawal and try to renew their advance south to complete the encirclement, but by this time Allied air power is in full swing and they only make limited advances. Only one major road is left leading towards Strasbourg, and the Germans shift their advance to cut off Strasbourg before the mountains. This is a great propaganda victory for the Germans. Whether or not they'd be able to actually capture the city is hard to say, especially with how effective Allied air power could be in supplying them, but if the division between the French and Americans was bad enough, it's possible that politics would have gotten in the way of supplying the French, leading to it falling into German hands, though I do find this very unlikely. All in all, the outcome of this scenario would be slightly more successful than in the Battle of the Bulge, seeing as the primary objective, Strasbourg, was much closer and more in reach to the German forces than Antwerp was to the German forces in our timeline during the Battle of the Bulge. However, the area itself is rather of minimal use other than being a propaganda victory. I believe the war would end around the same time, or possibly even sooner, as the main crossing of the Rhine happens in the north, and without a setback like the Battle of the Bulge, they would probably have been slightly further ahead of schedule. The best case scenario for the Germans in this instance is a shuffle in the French government and instability among Allied relations. The next option I'll go over is a smaller one. Another option for the Western Front was to downscale the operation to something more realistic, to attack the recently captured German city of Aachen. This was the only major German city under Allied occupation, and to recapture it would be significant. The American troops there that had just broken through were many, but they were worn down and needed refitting. Capturing Aachen would also plug the hole in the breached west wall and seriously set back the Americans' progress. The pincers would only have to go about 70 kilometers, as opposed to the 170 kilometers to Antwerp, and the roads would be mostly good here. What's more, the initial terrain for the offensive would be mostly forested areas, making it easier for the German forces to hide from Allied air power, similar to in the Battle of the Bulge. Let's go through this scenario. The battle begins and both pincers launch large armoured assaults on the flanks of the 9th US Army. Neither pincer achieves a full breakthrough due to the density of Allied troops here, but the Americans and British near the north are being forced back. The German 15th Army is pinning a lot of the US Army in place with frontal attacks. The southern pincer becomes bogged down by fierce American resistance, but spreads slightly further west. However, the northern pincer captures Maastricht, which is a big deal because now there's only one major road leading out of Aachen, that being Liege. To fully surround Aachen, the Germans would only need to cut this road here. The Allied High Command is stubborn and shown it won't leave Aachen. It would be too much to give up. Finally, on Christmas Day, the German pincers link up and turn Aachen into a cauldron. They begin their direct attacks on the city and offer surrender to the American troops there, to which the Americans respond with nuts, exactly how they responded in Bastogne in our timeline. The Germans expect the pocket to crumble. However, its defences are strong and the weather soon clears, meaning overwhelming Allied air power comes into play. The pocket is supplied well through the air. Flak positions around the pocket do damage to Allied air, but overall the pocket is stable. The Germans launch one final large attack, taking some more land, but by this time serious forces from the west break through and re-establish a link with Aachen. This forces the Germans to pull back from their exposed positions. They lose some equipment on the retreat. Aachen holds, but the lands east of it didn't. The Germans have captured a significant amount of territory and shortened the line, and overall delayed the Allied advance, but there is no moral victory here, as Aachen was never captured as it was too densely defended, and Allied air power proved to be too strong a factor. Overall, this operation would have prolonged effects. The US divisions in the pocket, and the ones involved in this combat, have been seriously mauled, and probably will take time to refit. Potentially, up to 16 Allied divisions have been put temporarily out of action. It's not unreasonable to think here that it would have taken the Allies an extra month now to cross the Rhine given the setback, as Aachen and the surrounding areas was sort of a jumping off point to reach the Rhine. Now there are other options here on the Western Front, like attacking Holland for example, and let me know down in the comments if you want to see more, but let's take a look at the Eastern Front now. The Eastern option is interesting, as it has long-term ramifications. Contrary to belief, the Soviet Red Army was not an inexhaustible pool of manpower. In fact, by 1945, Stalin had given explicit orders to his generals to perform their operations without reliance on any reinforcements. The Soviets were scraping the barrel. The German General Guderian and Armaments Minister Speer were strong proponents of this eastern option. Speer knew Upper Silesia was arguably the most important area industrially, and if the front can be pushed away from this area, production of armaments into 1945 could be continued. Even in our timeline, where the Soviets didn't have to fight off a German counterattack, they were integrating re-units into their frontline infantry. Their divisions were on average at 40 to 50% strength. Another factor is the German attack would have caught the Soviets at their most vulnerable. The Soviets were preparing for their offensive, and they were in an offensive posture, meaning it would take time for them to properly respond and redeploy to address the German attack. A major German attack with the 5th and 6th Panzer armies could have seriously thrown a spanner in the works. Let's take a look. Now, in terms of deployment, I believe a corps or two would have been diverted to try and reopen a land connection to the Courland pocket. The main force would have been deployed north of Warsaw, where terrain is best for mobile combat, and another force would have been sent further south to deal with the Soviet bridgeheads over the Vistula. The objectives are to surround and destroy Soviet units, capture Brest-Litovsk, re-establish a land connection with Kurland, and push the threat away from Upper Silesia. Whilst the Soviets definitely had air superiority, it is not nearly as decisive as the Western Allied air power. In fact, German air power in a last-ditch effort may even be able to give limited air cover. The German main attack crashes right into the Second Belarusian front. It's a breakthrough. The Soviets haven't really had to deal with an organised large-scale offensive of this size since Kursk. Within days, the major Polish city of Białystok falls. This is a shock to all. Now all the roads lie relatively open to Brest-Litovsk. The auxiliary attacks in the north and south also go off simultaneously. In the north, the Germans manage to link up with Memel and even get close to reaching Courland, but the Soviet redeployments prevent it. In the south, the German attacks on the bridgeheads are strong, but they don't initially push the Soviets back. It's only when the breakthrough further north occurs that the bridgeheads are taken due to Soviets having to withdraw to send troops north. The Germans continue their drive south, east towards Brest-Litovsk, and get very close within the city limits, but are stopped in their tracks by the Soviet armies in the south and lack of fuel. The Germans are forced to withdraw from the salient of Brest-Litovsk, but still pose a threat. The Germans once more launch another attack towards Courland, but this fails and they call it off. Given it took the Western Allies 40 days to rectify the Battle of the Bulge, it's not hard to imagine that it could have taken the Soviets 2 months to get back onto their full offensive swing. The Soviets still would have captured Königsberg and Warsaw, likely Krakow as well, but if the Allies didn't have to deal with an Ardennes offensive, I can definitely see the Allies meeting somewhere closer to Poznan in April or May. Ramifications. This outcome would have some serious consequences. None of these offensives would have any chance of preventing the fall of Germany. However, the Cold War would look quite different. Germany would almost be entirely occupied by the Western Allies except for East Prussia and East Berlin, as I can imagine the Western Allies would hand over East Berlin as a gesture of goodwill, just like how the Soviets handed over West Berlin to the Allies in our timeline. Germany would look more like this in modern day. The reason Poland took these western lands in our timeline is because Poland was pushed west by the Soviets as compensation for the Soviets annexing their eastern border, and the Germans in Prussia almost entirely evacuated these areas due to the Red Terror. Whereas if the Allies invaded, there is no Red Terror here, so the Germans stay and the Soviets can't enforce a border change. We now would see an east and west Poland instead. Poland may be given some of the Silesian lands from Germany, and probably Danzig, but other than that, Germany keeps its eastern border it got from the Treaty of Versailles. The Iron Curtain would be pushed 300 kilometers east, weakening the Soviets and changing history as we know it. We probably would have seen a Western Czech Republic and a Soviet-controlled Slovakia. The Balkans would have looked very similar to our timeline. Tragically, the cost of human life in the Holocaust would have been greater in this timeline due to the atrocities at Auschwitz and other eastern camps being able to continue operations for a few more months than in our timeline. Thanks for watching everyone. I know this isn't my usual type of video, but I'll be posting all kinds of topics on this channel, so let me know what you think down below in the comments. I would love it if you could take the time to subscribe or check out my Patreon. A lot of work goes into these videos. I'd love to make more, but I have to be realistic when it comes to feasibility. In any case, thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.